happy to have everyone here to hear Jennifer, Bartlett, who's been working with the Writer Center for about the last month or so, and that she has this wonderful book on Larry Eigner that she's been working on for years and years. Eric Parkison is our program director at the Writer Center, and he's going to take it on from this get-go. And please, I hope people will stay for a discussion after the deal.
Good.
So, thank you.
All right.
Okay.
All right, thank you, everybody. Thank you for coming out for this. This is my first time being an interviewer, so we'll see how it goes. I've written some, probably Jennifer thinks, obnoxiously extensive notes, and I've worked in reasons to read from parts of the book as we go, so that I hope you get to hear Jennifer's writerly voice. This is an extraordinary book, a very, very incisive read, and my feeling is that oftentimes with, let's see, how do I want to say this? I know Jennifer is a poet. I sometimes claim I am a poet. And I know that, very often when we're writing in the biographical mode, it can end up being so much about the kind of the day-to-day and the experiences of an individual. His wagon tipped over when he was 4, and he, et cetera, et cetera. And that stuff is there, but what I loved about this book was how much it's a poet's book. This is a book in which a poetic mind, a poetic imagination is reading the life of Larry Eigner through his letters. And so I just wanted to start with that appreciation. And I want to talk a little bit about the origins of the book and what brought you to the book. Oftentimes people talk about this, Toni Morrison quote, this thing she said, that writers are often compelled by finding out that the book that they want to read doesn't yet exist in the world. And when I was reading your introduction, I feel some of that, and then I also feel this element of serendipity, that it was the right time, et cetera, et cetera. And I'm wondering how you were thinking about that. What was there something about this book that you ended up feeling you needed to write? You ended up feeling it had to be in the world, or for yourself? Or to what extent did you feel that the book needed to be in the world because we have this local and kind of monumental poetic figure who exists at the nexus of all of these poetic movements, who gets short shrift. People don't really talk about him. Okay. I'm a bit long-winded. You go ahead.
That's okay.
Yeah.
Well, I do believe it's a book that needs to be written, but that's only in retrospect that you say that. I hadn't thought of that before, but at the time it was more serendipitous. It was 2010 when it started, and I was between jobs and between books and wanted a project, and then always wanted to write a biography. And I was going because you read the preface, I wanted to write a biography on Mary Kaiser, and I'm actually seriously revisiting that idea. But Larry Eigner's collected works had just come out. The 4-volume Stanford, and I had a friend who got me, when I told him about the book, he got me very excited. So there's a poet named Charles Bernstein who knew Larry, who was a good friend of mine. So I told him, and he thought it was a great project, and from there things just came to fall in place. Through him I met Robert Grenay, who lived with Larry for 10 years as Larry's caregiver, and then I met the Eigner family. Unfortunately, most of the people I interacted with died before the book came out, so that's kind of sad. But I was able to spend time with his brother Richard and wife Beverly. And then the second part is, in retrospect, I do feel like it needs to be written for all the reasons you said. We actually have very, very few stories out in the world about people with disabilities, and within that idea, we have almost no stories about people with severe disabilities, unless they kill themselves at the end of the movie. That's like in that movie, what was it called? $5 Million Baby or something?
Yeah.
How many dollars?
Well, I think it was million. I think it was only a single million. Maybe you've adjusted the title for inflation.
I never actually saw it, but supposedly it was the disability community hated that film because she
breaks her neck.
I'm not sure how disabled she was, but she killed herself. And I've actually had people tell me they'd rather be dead than be like me.
Good God.
Can you believe that?
I wish I could say no, I can't believe it, but I know the world.
It's hard on top of all these other traumas, dealing with systematic trauma.
Yes.
But as you said, even within the poetry community, no. In the 1950s in the poetry community, as you can tell from the book, he was pretty well regarded and well respected, and then later very beloved by the language poetry community, but he never became that well known in the larger poetry community, and even most people on the shore have heard of him. And wait a sec, and that's for a number of reasons. It's because poets of that era were supposed to be very manly and sexy. He didn't get out and do a lot of readings and drinking. He wasn't involved in a lot of AIDS scandals, really, except in his house. And also his work is very difficult. It's very ephemeral and elusive, and so while poets like Charles Olson and Vincent Perini and Bob Creeley, Denise Levertov, they all took on this sort of cachet,
Yeah.
and Larry sort of got left behind. But what's interesting is that Larry sort of connected all those
Yes.
people.
Yes, yeah.
Oh, and I have a really scandalous idea, but I can tell you later.
Okay.
Or I can tell you now.
Yeah, now.
No.
Yeah, I would always fail the marshmallow test, right? That whole thing where you gotta wait and get 3. I want the scandal right now.
Well, I really believe that when he read Projected Verse in 1950, he already had that developed in his mind.
Yeah. That he found kind of external confirmation of what already was part of his
What he
practice.
was thinking.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I believe it.
Okay, go ahead.
Okay. Well, so, one thing you're talking about is kind of this marginalization of him, the fact that even though he's at the nexus with all of these figures, all these, monumental figures of 20th century American poetry, that he's kind of shunted off to one side in a way. And I'm still in my questions here thinking about the process of writing the book, and I noted that you said in your acknowledgments, I don't know why. I think because we're in a time that's relatively skeptical of institutions. I don't trust the bank. I don't trust educational institutions. I don't trust this. I don't trust that. You said, because I had no institutional backing, I want to thank all of these people who helped me bring this book to light. And I was thinking one way that institutions can work negatively to create silences in the record is simply not funding, right? And not helping bring things to light. Maybe I'm just being too conspiratorial, but what was your relationship to institutions at the time that might have offered funding but didn't, or?
Well, I didn't apply for that many grants because they're very hard and usually don't have one.
As you know.
Like with them,
Yeah.
Although I did get a number of New York State grants for my poetry, not for this book.
Okay.
But I applied for a Guggenheim, I applied for the big biography prize is the Leon Levy prize.
Okay.
And it's $60,000 in the office at CUNY. But if you look at who they fund, it's literally like the 7th book of Elizabeth Bishop.
Really? Yeah.
Yeah.
So it's these figures that already have cachet.
Yeah. It's like, well, no one disabled, people of color, which is good, or people who are really well known already, like presidents and so on.
Got it.
So I thanked all those people because I did a Kickstarter and people gave me money, which was nice.
Yeah. Which again kind of speaks to the fact that there was this desire for this kind of book or this information to be out there. Let's see here. So I wonder, so you say in your introduction, Larry Eigner and I have 3 things in common. We are poets, we have cerebral palsy, and we have an unwavering passion for Charles Olson. So in my reading, my feeling, again, I was reading from kind of a poet's perspective, and it felt to me that oftentimes the most kind of the most intimate connections you had with Eigner's life was kind of poetry first, I wonder, I don't know how to ask the question, but was there a sense of hierarchy there about where you connected with him and what kind of led you as you were doing the work?
Well, honestly, and this is a little more, it sort of went back and forth, but it's the poems and the letters. His letters were very difficult to learn how to read. I don't know if you've ever read books of letters, but it's very difficult to read anybody's books of letters, and then they were so difficult to read because he meandered from topic to topic. He typed all over the page. There were tons of typos, and just the thing that you have to figure out who everyone is, and then you're not reading letter against letter. So, say he writes to St. Corman, you don't necessarily have the letter back
Sure.
to St. Corman. So, but once I learned how to do it, they became very, very engaging and full of gossip, full of interesting information, just fascinating. And sort of intuitively, I guess, I decided to base the biography almost solely on letters.
Yeah.
I only did a small handful of interviews. I think I interviewed like 7 people or something, and I didn't even use all those people.
Yeah.
And I shied away from something. I'm a big biographer reader, memoir reader.
Yeah.
And I shy away from something that people do that I really hate, which is I'm trying to think of a good. I'll just make something crazy up, like, okay, on the day he was born, it was 62 degrees and sunny, and there were chickens in the yard and children playing outside. Okay, you can factually find out that maybe there was 62 degrees that day, but have people, have you ever noticed that people do this in biographies?
Yeah.
They're just making a bunch of shit up.
Yeah.
It's like they just, and I find that very annoying.
Yeah.
And you'll see in the book, there's nothing I personally made up.
Yeah.
Every sentence, I may have made some mistakes or read something I thought I didn't, but it's so heavily researched.
Yes. Yeah.
Like that whole first chapter is so diligently researched. Like I would say, okay, I spent like 3 hours of research on the hurricane of 1939 on the North Shore, which is one sentence.
Right.
That's
right.
one
Exactly.
sentence.
Yeah.
And then I left it out, but I left it out. I think, I can't remember, but marshmallow fluff was invented in Swampscott.
Okay.
So I did like 5 hours of research of everything famous and
Yeah, yeah.
everybody famous in Swampscott.
And yeah, it doesn't.
Which I didn't even put in the book.
Right.
I think Leslie Stahl was
Yes.
born. And do you remember
Leslie
who
Stahl was
else?
born. Yeah.
There were a couple of famous.
A handful
Just
of.
had a friend who grew up in Swampscott who told me that.
Yeah,
Oh.
Leslie Stahl.
Huh.
Maybe Sylvester Stallone.
Really?
I don't think so. And then Pierce, someone said it wasn't. You guys would know that someone said I was wrong. That the dory, I think Grace said I was wrong. The dory was invented in Swampscott.
No,
The
that's
Swampscott dory was.
But
It's different.
the Swampscott dory. So it's not a normal dory.
Well, it's normal, it's not fishing.
Oh, it's not a fishing dory.
The dories we have are just terrible to row unless you have a ton of fish in the bottom.
Well, I didn't do that good research on that because I don't even know what dory is. So
And I can confirm the
It's-
book
it's
does
a
not
boat.
start. Huh?
It's
Yes,
a
it's a
boat.
boat. Yeah.
Yeah.
I can confirm the book does not start on the day Larry Eigner was born. The scent of marshmallow fluff was in the air.
yeah.
Yeah.
But my friend Tara and I went to the town. We walked around. We drove back to Larry's house. We tried to meet people in the neighborhood. And I stayed the square. The Swampscott Square
Yep.
was developed by Olmsted.
Yes. Yeah. That whole neighborhood there allegedly.
Yeah,
Right,
so
yeah.
this is probably why it took 12 years. And
Yeah.
I find this kind of research very engaging
Yes. Yeah.
and nourishing.
Did you find it? I wanted to ask you earlier what your before the book what your relationship to his poetry was, but now that you've added this element, I'll ask: did you find it in some way rewarding, or did it refresh your reading of the poetry when you came back to it after this research in the area, seeing 23 Bates Road and all of that?
A little bit, yeah. A
Yeah.
little bit. It gave me sort of a deeper understanding, and living here for a while has given me deeper
Yeah.
understanding. But I also found out, it was just endless. When you read these letters, first I want to say, Larry must have corresponded with at least 200 people in
Yeah.
his lifetime. He
Yeah.
corresponded with Margaret Randall, Louis Zukowski, Gerard Mangala from the factory. My friend George and I found a letter to Larry from Andy Warhol's factory, and
A boat builder in Maine.
oh yeah,
Right.
the boat builder in Maine.
Yeah.
In the end, I couldn't do too much with him, but he did have a close friend
Yeah.
named Arthur McFarland, who he corresponded diligently.
Yeah.
But through these letters, I found out the weirdest stuff. And this is stuff where you did research. It was so hard to find any information. So he mentions, I found out about this guy named Achilles Fang. Achilles.
That's a great name.
It is.
Yeah.
it turns out to be a guy who wrote a long dissertation on why that Pound didn't know any Chinese, and the Cantos, and he faked all the Chinese.
Uh-huh.
He wrote like a 400-page dissertation about this.
Yeah.
The other thing I found out was I've only found one mention of it in one place in Charles Bernstein's book. Sid Corman's magazine Origin. Sid Corman was the person who brought Larry into the world of poetry. They met when Larry heard his radio program
Out of Boston.
on WMEX, and interestingly enough, he co-did that program with Nat Hentoff, who became a famous Village Voice writer. They went to high school together. There's another bizarre fact. But so Larry wrote him a letter complaining about his reading of Yeats, and
Literally his vocalization of it?
he said something to do with declamatoriness. And what was I going to say? And that started a 50-year correspondence. And so Corman had this magazine called Origins, and I went to the New York Public Library and went through all the origins, and because I was thinking about how women were represented at the time, and there weren't many, but in one issue there's someone published named Horror Pornoff, and I was like, what?
How was her work?
Who's this?
Yeah.
I don't remember.
Yeah. Yeah.
You do? No.
No, you do.
But somehow I managed to find out that this was actually Clayton Eshelman, the poet Clayton Eshelman, making fun of the critic Marjorie Perloff and writing crappy poems.
Oh my God, yeah?
Yeah, so this stuff is just, I don't know if it's interesting to anyone else, but it was pretty riveting
Yeah.
to me.
Yeah, no, I personally, I love stuff like that. I love letters. I love the odd little facts and the little avenues you can go down. But I'm going to try to shift our trajectory a little bit.
Okay.
So I wanted to talk about this little section of our thing I'm hoping we can call embodied poetics. So early in the book, you're talking about how cerebral palsy conditions Eigner's childhood. He has surgeries and shock therapy. He has to go to a specific camp with other disabled children that he doesn't especially relish going to. And he refers to his left side, which has more spasming, as his wild side,
Yes.
which I really love.
Yes.
Can you talk about how common or uncommon the family's approach to disability was?
It was completely uncommon.
Uncommon.
Completely. In America, at least. I mean, Christy by my life was born around the same time, and I just pretty much. In Iceland, they probably took care of you or let you freeze to death, I don't know. But in America and England, what they did was they put you in an institution.
Mm-hmm.
Or if the family had means, they kept you at home,
Mm-hmm.
but you weren't educated. There were no resources, no education.
Mm-hmm.
They were lucky to be in Massachusetts. The school he went to, Massachusetts Hospital School,
Mm-hmm.
was the first school in the nation for children with disabilities.
Mm-hmm.
And there were these camps, but his experience was extremely different, I think,
Yeah.
from any other severely disabled child's experience. Other children in his situation might have been kept at home and well cared for, but they wouldn't have been pushed to be educated in the way his mother fought for and pushed for him to be educated, and to have him have someone buy that typewriter for a bar mitzvah gift. And, he always complained that his parents weren't supportive enough of his poetry, and in some ways they weren't.
Yeah.
But it was extremely rare for this to happen.
Yeah.
I mean, and he was born in 1926. That went on for a while. The other day, Grace and I were talking about Rosemary Kennedy, who was born I think later. I mean, this was, people with disabilities really didn't have any education to the 70s, basically.
And so really it was kind of his luck to be born to his mother who was very kind of proactive. And
and interest in poetry, interest in literature.
Yes, although he says, I forget who he is writing to, but he said my parents wish that I would write greeting cards or for TV or nothing, rather than poetry.
Yeah.
A situation that I believe has not changed for the poet.
Right.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Did his mother educate him personally, or did she hire tutors?
So, he was educated by his mother until middle school, and then he went to Massachusetts Hospital School for 6th, 7th, and 8th grade, which was a sleepaway school in Canton. Then when he got back, she had someone come from the high school, Swampscott High School, and got a high school degree. Then he did 7 correspondence courses through the University of Chicago, and then he started to self-educate himself.
Yeah.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Yeah. And so I wanted to think a little bit about again, I'm not sure exactly how to put it, but this idea that the conversation around disability and people with disabilities, it's something we're continuing to work on. It's something that continues to change. I hope we can say improve, although sometimes when I'm walking down the sidewalk, I just think, who could make it down this sidewalk? right? Our infrastructure isn't very friendly.
Yeah.
But so part of what the book teaches is a history of our responses to and the experience of cerebral palsy. And many of the moving passages are about Eigner's experience of his condition or people's responses to him. I want to read a small bit to you from chapter 5, 10 words a minute, when he's excited about his typewriter. But it says, Eigner's friend Arnold Goldman, who also grew up in Swampscott, remembered him as a young man, quote, parked in his wheelchair watching the football games. He recalled, I remember him because he gesticulated wildly. In our ignorance, my peers didn't know what to make of it. We didn't know anything about cerebral palsy. Goldman also remembered Eigner telling him about the school children walking down Bates Road mocking his mannerisms. He said that eventually they would grow used to him and lose interest until another generation of children would come along. At the time, Eigner claimed to be more amused than hurt by the exchanges. Although he never complained about his cerebral palsy, he was socialized to ignore it in certain respects, and his response to the children may have been the best way with dealing with that situation. I was struck there just, toward the end by that idea. He was socialized to ignore it. And I'm curious, throughout the book you talk about kind of his strong willpower in downplaying the impacts of his condition on his life, and in being frustrated by the way different people responded to him, or being outright angry, as when the documentary film crew makes a relatively terrible documentary about him with a bunch of lies in it. But I was thinking about the question of kind of, is it social practice or just Larry himself who came up with that strength of self, or that resiliency in the face of mockery or children being cruel to him? Just curious where you think the balance is there. How much?
I don't really understand what you mean.
I don't understand what I mean either. Let me try again.
Okay.
I mean that you said that he's socialized to ignore his treatment. That might be one way that his parents or his broader family would instruct him in protecting himself.
Yeah.
Versus how much of it was just kind of his own, because he seems to me throughout the book, all due respect to him, like a pretty stubborn man, and, and you know what I mean, and a pretty strong-willed man.
That actually was a very good sentence.
What?
That I wrote.
The one that...
Yeah. What I meant was, so there was this thing about his family never made a big deal about his cerebral palsy, and he never said stuff like, I wish I didn't have cerebral palsy, or I wish he never said stuff like that. And that's usually the attitude of people with cerebral palsy. They'll complain about their cerebral palsy a lot, maybe, although I can't, because I'm afraid that if I complain about my cerebral palsy, that people will think I'm a weak person. So I just don't.
I mean, that's again where it meets that social
Although
pressure.
I complain about my mental illness every 5 minutes. For some reason.
Yeah.
But I think that's because people with cerebral palsy are born what was that? That silly singer born this way.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
Lady Gaga.
So it's just the body we happen to fall into.
Yes.
And we work with what we have.
Mm-hmm.
On the other hand, I think he had a lot of what I would call internalized ableism. Ableism is prejudice against people with disabilities, and I think he had that because, like you say, he didn't want to go to the camp.
Mm-hmm.
And at the camp, he made fun of the other,
Yeah.
calling what was that fight line? These cripples out trying to float around.
Oh, yes.
Yeah.
Right.
It was hilarious.
Yeah.
And so he didn't want to be part of that community, or he wanted to just be a poet.
Yes, yeah.
Which is a little different from wanting to be with able-bodied people, but he didn't really want to be associated with disabled people, and that became a real issue when he moved to Berkeley,
Yeah, right.
because they wanted him to live at
No.
a group home and have resources, and he couldn't
He said no.
do it.
Yeah.
He was spoiled.
So that actually dovetails pretty well with my next overly confusing question. So apologies in
Okay.
advance. So I want to read a kind of a long passage because I think it introduces complexities about his thought, and this gets to what we were just talking about. I think a thing I had difficulty with, and I still haven't kind of made a decision about as I've been reading the book, is that he wants to hold these two ideas in mind at the same time. The first being that he's not reducible to his body. That is, the circumstances of his body, that's not him. And then at the same time, through Olson's idea of projective verse, his poetics is grounded in the particularity of his body. And I'm trying to figure out what I think about that tension, but I wanted to read from some of your wonderful book to kind of introduce this idea. So we'll start here. When a cousin visited the Eigners in February 1954, Larry wrote to Creeley that he was from up at U of Iowa, peddling eagerly, seriously, air to Lowell. His cousin was studying with the poet at the Iowa Writers' Workshop and evidently shared From the Sustaining Air with Lowell. From the Sustaining Air being his first book, is that right? No. No. Yes?
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah.
From the Sustaining Air.
Yes.
Yeah. The poet was critical of the work, and Eigner wrote to Creeley that Lowell claimed it too bad that this was the maximum reached by young poets, because few working in this style ever get any farther. He called Lowell's opinion the academic touch. Although Eigner would later meet Lowell, the poet's criticism of his work probably helped solidify his rejection of both confessional and academic poetry. Eigner didn't want to follow the lead of the confessional poets and make his personal experience central to his work. If he had taken this path, he would have written directly about his cerebral palsy like the poets Vassar Miller or Christy Brown. When he did write about disability, especially in his early work, he typically wrote about it as the experience of the other, except for what he called the hospital poems, written when he was in Massachusetts General Baker Memorial Hospital, recovering from surgery in the early 1960s. He rarely wrote about disability from a personal perspective. When he did, he portrayed it in a negative light, such as in the poem The Caricature. And these are visual poems, so I'll give a reading of this, but it really is kind of, it lives on the page. The Caricature. Man, as if out of a painting, in a blazer pushing a chair, in which is another lolling cripple, and the epileptic is wild for a moment, like a machine, thin, especially in the arms, and sometimes afterward, scarcely, yet one of the office. I take it for what she is, or is quite likely to be, yet with that happened face, her biggest keeping thing, and the legs. I sometimes imagine myself movements. men. Aptly named, the poem describes a doctor figure in a blazer, no less, pushing a lolling cripple in a wheelchair. The term cripple harks back to the early poem, A Wintered Road, one of the first poems he sent to Corman, in which he used the term as a metaphor. Here he uses it quite literally, possibly to describe something he saw on television or from one of his stays in the hospital. The fact that the poem is named The Caricature is supposed to press back against the norms of how people with disabilities were regarded, and the description of the epileptic is wild for a moment, could be a description of Eigner's own wild left side. Interestingly, he refers to the body as a machine, a reference to William Carlos Williams' idea of the poem as a machine composed of words, and Eigner's own idea of the body as a machine made for walking.
Is
Great
that a
writing.
quote, machine made for walking?
No, it's not.
Or did
It's-
I read?
you wrote it.
Oh,
What do you think? How's that sentence?
yeah,
Pretty good.
well, I like not to go off on a tangent, but
Yeah.
I like that you brought up Juan Carlos Williams, a machine, a poem,
Is a machine.
of words,
Mhm.
because it's interesting they really latched on to that because he didn't really like William Carlos Williams,
Yeah.
and he compared the Maximus poems to Patterson, which were both published right about the same time, and he landed on Olson. He
Yeah.
thought Maximus was a much better book, and he called it freewheeling. But you have to understand that in his, so he grew up writing, but he started writing, people transcribed for him. He started writing poems probably from the time he was about 6. And he grew up on Longfellow. So he started out writing very formal,
Yes.
normal poems. But as I said, something in his brain wanted to get away from that. So this whole Lowell thing is part of that. It's part of breaking away from any kind of traditional form. And as I said, when first he read E. Cummings, and they read projective verse. And by the time he read those, in the back of his mind, he was already looking for new ways to write poetry.
Yeah.
So that's the form of it. But the content, he didn't want to tell the story of his life. He didn't want to be a confessional poet. That isn't what interested him.
Yeah.
And that's why this group called the Language Poets later loved him so much, because they wanted to take the I out of poetry.
Right.
And when you read Lowell, Sexton, Plath, it's all about the I.
Yeah.
The I is central, or not the letter I, but like me.
The self.
Me.
Yeah.
me.
Yeah.
And but then you brought up that thing about his body, so it's interesting. His body was in the form, not the content.
His body presented itself in the poetry
Form.
in the form, not the content.
His body presented itself in the form, not the content. It was the spacing,
Yes.
which was diligent and purposeful,
Yes.
and the margins and so on.
and it seemed like a new approach to building form. This kind of thing.
Yeah.
You talk about later in the book how he would correct even his published books. He would go through and correct the spacing, insistent that the space of the line and the spaces of the words across the page wasn't quite correct compared to what he'd accomplished on the typewriter.
Right.
And so, interestingly, although he's kind of pressing back against, we'll use Lowell as a stand-in, but as like the kind of academic, poetic tradition, the left margin, fearful to get away from that left margin. His formalism is in some ways just as rigorous, right?
Yeah. Yeah. Well, no, it's more. Well, is it more rigorous or less rigorous?
Right.
So when we had coffee, I told you that, like, okay, if you write a sestina, I'm not putting anyone down, and I've written a sestina, it's hard. I love sestinas, particularly by Elizabeth Bishop. But if you write a sonnet or a sestina, I'm going to be very harsh. All you're doing is plugging in words. It's like you've got a
template.
A Google template for a poem.
Yeah.
But he didn't have a template.
Yeah.
So is it harder to conform to a template, or is it harder to make up your own template with every poem?
Right.
I'd say it depends on the person and the poet and like I came up with this at some point. I started writing all my poems in couplets. My entire last two, I think, no, not all of them, but a lot of my last two books, all the poems were couplets, and this was just something that felt organic to me.
Yeah. And it's the question for Larry Eigner is the question of kind of this exactly organic form, and what he was doing was very rigorously pursuing through his thumb and forefinger, which is how he typed all of his poetry out.
Yeah.
He was pursuing the invention of a form that matched his experience of self in some way.
Yeah.
Great.
Yeah.
Awesome. Okay. Well, let me. I feel like such a fool for my notebook, but.
You should.
So I guess I do want to, in a relatively academic way, think a little bit more, and we'll bring this conversation to a close relatively soon, but I wanted to think a little bit more about this question of schools of poetry. We said earlier on in the conversation that he was at the nexus of all these movements in that mid-century poetic, honestly, Lowell felt that after Pound and after the moderns, that everybody was just completely lost, that they were just trying to figure out what to do. And so the downside of that is you get all the depressive eye poetry, all the carousing drunks destroying themselves, but you also get this flowering of all these different approaches to what this work can be.
First of all, Lowell knew who Ezra Pound is.
Did Lowell know who Ezra Pound was?
I found that shocking.
Oh yeah, no, he was one of the ones that visited him in St. Elizabeth's or St. Mary?
St.
Elizabeth's. Yeah.
Wow, I never put those two seem so wildly different.
I'm thinking about that Ron Silliman book that he dedicates to Larry Eigner called The American Tree.
In the
American Tree, and that idea is throughout American poetic history. Pound says about Whitman, like, we come from one root and one sap. I've made my peace with you, Walt Whitman, right?
Yeah.
And so you have Whitman and Dickinson as these kind of original poets of the American 19th century who kind of create every movement that comes afterward. But anyway, so then in the 50s you have this kind of explosion of 50s into the 70s, the language poets, projective verse, the confessional
beats,
poets, the beats,
The
right?
confessional,
Right.
the language poet.
Yeah, and
Elizabeth Bishop.
and Elizabeth Bishop, whatever she
We-
was, our
And
masterworker.
the Elizabeth Bishop category.
Yeah, and
She
the Elizabeth
gets
Bishop.
her own.
I think that's right. I
Yeah,
think that's
yeah.
absolutely
She
right.
gets her own category.
She does.
Yeah.
So in his foreword to your book, George Hart says he finds Eigner a postmodern nature poet, and we talked about this a little bit, right? This idea that Eigner might have something to do with romantic poetry or nature poetry. So I'd like to spend some time with your description of his work on page 86 through 87. Look what a good boy I am doing my homework.
That's great.
Yeah. And then I'd like to hear from you about the schools of poetry. And I have more pages to read as well. So the passage of time in general was very much a consideration in Eigner's work, and he often used it in the titles of his books. Like many people with disabilities, Eigner experienced time in a unique way. This concept would later come to be known crip time, or the idea that disabled people have circumstances from their own impairments and social conditions that prohibit them from moving through the world at the same pace as able-bodied people. Despite this, he also wrote at one point that time has never passed slowly. He describes himself as someone who, quote, had never known boredom. The circumstances of his life created the possibility for deep observation and reflection, and time for him had a quality of fragmentation. He wrote in the poem Again Dawn, and I apologize for not having this projected on a screen or something, but the sky dropped. Its invisible whiteness we saw pass out nowhere. Empty the blue stars. Our summer on the ground, like last night, another time in fragments. Birds also were constantly present in his poems. With few exceptions, he did not name the kind of bird or any kind of object in his poems. Harking back to William Carlos Williams, he stayed true to the idea of things for the sake of themselves rather than as metaphors, leaving out unnecessary adjectives or other descriptors. It could be argued that the birds that were ubiquitous in his poems represented a kind of freedom of movement that he could not experience. Again, he was aware of Williams's notion that a poem is a machine made of words. His interest in the interconnectedness of nature and humanity, the machines of the television and radio, was reflected throughout his poems, not to mention in the machines needed for him to move through the world, first his walker, then his wheelchair. Although the lines in his poems were fragmented, they remained declarative. He didn't include commentary or give the reader guidelines for how to read the poem. Instead, he would invoke a scene, and like a wanderer, the reader would have to create their own interpretation. Instead of creating a kind of confessional or narrative poetry that guided one through a story or experience, Eigner observed that writing and reading a poem has, quote, often enough been like discovering things. In this, the poems often took on aspects of nature walks without the walking. He considered the writings of poems to be like an essay, to relay things come upon or a stretch of thinking. He came to believe that poems had their own organic shape and motion that was not entirely controlled by their author, who should be, quote, willing enough to stop any time, even though the poet might have the tendency to want to live forever in the poem. A poem could extend itself naturally, quietly, and it ought to have the same effect on the reader, who could stop or pause anywhere. I think that's a beautiful description of what he's accomplishing in his work.
Thank you.
And going back to our earlier conversation that you and I had talking about this idea that he might be a kind of romantic poet, it seems like what he's accomplished is the kind of inversion of the romantic inspiration, right? He doesn't wander the hills and find the cataract and see there the awe that connects him to God. Instead, he is, for his reader, building a country out of his psyche, his poetic self, that they're allowed to step into, and it's there in the creation of that country that his work is done. Does that
Yeah.
make sense as a reading of the poetry?
Yeah.
And so again, this question of tying him to a specific school or trend is is
Well,
extraordinarily
no.
difficult.
Yeah, well, no, it's actually very easy. He was just putting Black Mountain, because that's the people he hung out with.
You think he was
Yeah,
that's you would call him like a Black Mountain poet?
well, it depends on if you follow, Donald Allen's book.
Yes.
Yeah,
The
that
New American poetry.
New American Poetry since 1950 or something.
Yeah.
That's where all these people were categorized, and he was put in that category.
Mhm.
And
Do you?
And-
I mean, how do you feel about that? Do you accept that, or
I always have. I never really thought of it. If you think of that category, okay, if you take Denise Levertov,
Mhm.
Charles Olson, Larry Eigner,
Mhm.
Robert Duncan, who was sort of on the fence
Yeah.
between Black Mountain and San Francisco Renaissance. Did I say Robert Creeley?
Not yet, but here.
And what did their poetry have in common? Nothing.
Yeah.
It didn't have anything in common. Their poems were all completely different.
Yeah.
So some of those categories, some of those categories are sort of made up anyway, and that one in particular was just because it was the school that they all tried to, where they all hung out together, and the people with the search. I mean, even if you think of, I think it's Duncan, Rexroth, Spicer,
Mhm.
and a few other people. What did their work have in common?
Right.
Nothing. They all lived in San Francisco. So,
Yeah.
and I wonder if even Kerouac, Jim Dyke could answer this. I wonder if he would Kerouac and Ginsberg and
Burroughs.
Burroughs and Diane Markovsky. Was their work alike, do you
I would
think?
say not. I would say they had certain similarities in their approach.
Okay.
But no.
So,
Look at Wieners. Wieners is Black Mountain. He's in
yeah,
unclassified.
I always
Yeah.
forget him.
Yeah.
Sorry. Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
So a lot of these labels are
Yeah.
just, these schools are just fabricated
Sure. Yeah.
labels.
Yeah. Yeah.
My dad told me, I can't remember the story, but beat poetry was just something some guy made up in a magazine, in the newspaper. I can't remember the whole story.
Yeah. Wasn't
Where beat came from?
Yeah, beat.
Well, it was Kerouac's friend who wrote Go, John Clone Holmes.
Rexroth told me that he's the one who invented the Beat Generation.
But to come up with-
I thought he was in San Francisco Renaissance.
Yeah.
See my
But-
point?
Oh, yes. Yeah.
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 So, yeah, these are just sort of random.
It's always
categories.
artifice, yeah, but
It's just a reason for poets to fight. Like, they can set up these categories. Although I have to say, the language poets, they had like a manifesto.
Yeah.
They had.
which means they had great fights,
Yeah, they had like a policy.
a program.
A policy. Yeah.
Thank you for this conversation. I want to end with one final question, rather than kind of looking back and trying to figure out what school Larry Eigner fits into. I wonder, thinking about the work you've done in this book and what you've kind of uncovered and intuited and taught us through the reading of the book, what do you think poets today still have to learn from Eigner? Do you think there are lessons that he has for the contemporary writer, or things he has to show people that they still have yet to see in some ways?
Yes, but I want to go back to the
Okay.
because now he's placed in eco-poetics, which is where he belongs, because he was very
Concerned about
interested in ecology, very interested in the environment, obsessed with it, really. He was really influenced by Rachel Carson and did tons of research on the environment and wrote letters to the editor about it, so, and plus his poetry, so he's very much eco-poetic.
I see.
And of course, I don't know, I just think, I just think people could be more open-minded about poetry and just try to read poetry that's different. Don't always, people rarely read poetry anyway, and when they do, they want to read it like prose.
Yeah.
Yeah. What time is it?
Anyone else?
Because I was going to see if we had time for questions.
Time for questions?
Yeah,
Yeah.
excuse my naivety about it, but, I always find it like interesting, like you are disabled and you wrote about a disabled poet. And it's like, I somehow take like a little bit aback by that, because he was a poet, first and foremost. And it's kind of like, oh, my black neighbor. Do you know, him being defined as that. Whereas his, poetry was not necessarily, and I don't know that much about it, and I have not read your book, unfortunately, but I just mean I always think it's an interesting dynamic to kind of present somebody with, they are not just an artist, they are a disabled artist, right? And so I'm interested in how you approach that and going into it. I don't know if that's...
Well, I'm trying to understand the question.
Well, I guess the question
It
is...
reminds me that quote in Basquiat.
Oh.
In Basquiat, where he says something like, are you an artist or black artist? And Basquiat says, I use all the colors. But
Right, but that is sort of my, but absurd question, because yes, it all is who he was, but I get really concerned and cringe at pigeonholing.
Well, you should read the book. He's not pigeonholed at all.
I'm not saying that I
He's
that you do, but I just,
yeah. Now Peter Lowfield will answer this
That is kind of a difficult question for you to answer.
Yeah.
But
So now my representative will answer.
for you, but
No.
you know, if I had a question, the thing that I was going to ask you, and you touched on it in different ways, and in a way you touched on it in your last question, but you touched on it when you talked about form, his pursuit of form. One of the things in the book that I love the most is the picture of how he, as a very young person, through the force of his intelligence, stakes out this territory of poetry and starts to mine it. And this is not a book about a disabled poet. This is a book about a poet who then, through the circumstances of his life, which includes being disabled, makes poetry. And it's something that you get at very, very, with a lot of immediacy in the book. It's also the thing that I relate to the most, this question of how any of us, when we're young, and maybe we're a little odd, or we're a little off-center to the rest of the world, start to find, sorry?
Maybe a lot.
Start to find a field.
And now here we are in an odd lot. Yeah, go ahead. I'm sorry.
And something that feels whole to us, something complete. And then through a powerful willfulness, just keep mining it against a lot of odds. That seems to be the story of the book. And it's the way that you lay out, and the question of why would he be relevant to a young poet? Because of that, because of the intensity of his creativity. Yeah. That's always the lesson.
That's true,
That's always the lesson.
And
That's
young
great.
poets are like that. And I'm not sure this addresses the question, but I believe that I'm the one who should have written this book. I don't believe an able-bodied person should. I don't.
absolutely, no, absolutely. No, and I appreciate your answer. I guess I get concerned about like a larger view.
What do you mean by pigeonhole?
I mean that it is he was a poet who was relevant in this time for being a poet.
Right, yes.
And that's it. I mean, you could almost end it there.
No.
Because when Bob Grenier was here, Bob Grenier had a very good kind of theoretical approach and talked about, Olson's theories of embodiment and proprioception. And according to Bob Grenier, that Eigner was the epitome of projective verse, because you could not understand Eigner's poetry without understanding the embodiment of that poetry, the physicality of the way that it was put on the page.
Yeah, that's true. But hold on, Bing. But I'm sorry, Susan. If you're a minority, you can never just stop there.
Yeah.
Only white men and women who are cis and heterosexual in America can just stop there. And some people would argue that not only they can, but I believe they can. If you're gay or trans or disabled, there is no just stopping there. Because you're not thought of as an equal in this country.
Right.
You are an Iceland, but there's that many black people, so that's not fair exactly. Okay, Bing. Thanks.
Oh, yes, well, when I was gonna maybe change the topic, I absolutely love your book, first of all.
Thank
I mean,
you.
it just flowed along.
Yeah.
And the chapters were just the right length, so you kept going, and it was like a fantastic, series. And, my interest was the family relationship.
Oh, yeah.
Because we're all products of our family. Everybody's got a mother. And the relationship with him and his mother was fascinating. Because she was unique, as you said, and she said, well, there's nothing you can't do, as long as you do it my way. And I know what that's like. And, he was blessed to have this family, because otherwise we wouldn't be sitting here talking about Larry. Don't you agree?
I do. I think we're shocked by have a comment.
Well, not knowing anything about his poetry, but reading the book because he wrote it, I felt that he didn't appreciate his mother at all.
Speaking as a mother.
And I'm a mother of a child who was disabled, and you can't win. I mean, you could give everything to your kid, and then the kid goes, I don't need you.
Yeah.
Get out,
Yeah.
And I guess that's what he did too. He really was not very knowledgeable about about his mother. That's what I didn't like about the guy.
Yeah, Grace told me that.
Not self-knowledgeable.
Spoken like a mother.
He was spoiled.
He was spoiled.
He
It's
didn't
exactly what she said earlier.
appreciate it.
Yeah.
He didn't appreciate it.
There was
All he did was complain about it constantly.
I was just reading
Every second.
rereading the passage in the book where I forget who's come into the house, and the guy is saying, oh, Larry, your mother was asking me about myself, and we were having this conversation,
Yeah.
and Larry
That
says,
was-
oh, forget, stop thinking about her, we have poetry to talk about.
That was actually Sam Charters.
Sam Charters?
And Ann and Sam Charters knew him and published one of his chapbooks. But I really loved it when Grace told me that, because it was a fresh perspective. I had heard that or thought of it before, and it was sort of true. I mean, I was always seeing it. I was always seeing it from his point of view of being a 30-year-old man who's every move is dictated by your brother. You can't have sex, you might get to masturbate, you can't choose when you go to bed, when you get up, you can't. I mean, that would be hard. That would be hard.
How did he have to fight to free himself? Including not treating his mother very well.
Well, I have to jump in here on the idea of stubbornness. First of all, I have not read the book, and thank you for a really interesting, really wonderful conversation.
Thank you.
But having worked with kids with learning differences for years, this whole idea of stubbornness, I spent a lot of time thinking about. And then it jumped to when you talked about temperance and having one or not having, one. But I think there's something about stubbornness that really gets in here with whether it's because the mother is bearing down and you're stubborn because you say, well, nobody gets it, so I gotta go my own way. And they're forcing me into this cookie cutter place.
Yeah.
I don't know how you feel about that, but
Yeah.
it fascinated me
Yeah.
for a long time.
Yeah.
As I see it with my kids who are stubborn, or adults,
Yeah.
Yeah.
and they're stubborn because there's no other way. I mean, I think the sense is nobody else understands me, nobody else gets it. I get it. I mean, I know what I can do.
So if we were to honor it, we might call it persistence rather than stubbornness.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
that's right.
In the end,
Yeah.
the work just has to stand on its own.
Yeah,
No matter
that's
what. I mean,
true.
Toulouse-Lautrec was 3 feet tall or something.
Yeah.
But when you look at the work, that gets lost. That's lost. You're just looking at the work.
Yeah.
Not thinking
You have to
about
remember
what he
too.
looked like or what his day was like.
When he went to California, he got a whole new lease on life because he was a great poet, and then you can't forget he wrote over 3,000 poems. When
Yeah.
you read those poems, although it came through that body and came through that person, he transcends it because the poem is just some big
Yeah.
poem. And
Yeah.
3,000 poems, and that book that came
Yeah.
out.
Yeah.
Yeah, the Garrett had it. Remember, there was
This
right?
Hulk is the selected.
Well, also, we didn't mention he wrote a novella, I think 2 plays, a novella, 2 plays, number of short stories, like 20 short stories, letters to the editor. He wrote to the Saturday Evening Post all the time, and then all these
correspondence.
hundreds of correspondences. I have argued to people that in some ways his disability was good luck because he didn't have to do anything but write all day. He didn't have to, yeah. How about that, babe? Didn't have to grocery shop or wash those dishes or feed the cat or do anything.
Great.
On that note,
I think on that note, we'll bring it to a close. Thanks everybody for coming. Thank you. Thank you very much for the book. Let's mingle and nibble cheese.
Thank you very much.
Before we do that, Jennifer, where can people find the book?
Unfortunately, I don't have any copies, but it's, University